First off, if you're new to this podcast, I suggest you first listen to podcast number 88 to get a grasp of what is going on, or even better, return to the start of Season 2 podcast number 41, which is the beginning of this podcast series for the public inquiry. And if you listened to the last podcast and managed to stay with me through water framework directives, water bodies, mixing zones, natural background concentrations, and even the rather grandly named physiochemical quality elements, which apparently I managed to mispronounce in the last podcast, as my ever vigilant friends were quick to let me know, then take a bow and congratulations. You made it, and frankly, I think we all deserve some sort of certificate. But having spent all that time trying to understand this new European Commission guidance, I was left wondering what I should actually do with it. My first instinct was that this follow-on podcast should be about what we as a community need to do in response. And then I realised something rather important. We don't actually know what we're responding to yet. We know that just before the inquiry broke, the applicants asked for this newly published European Commission guidance to be put before the inquiry. We know that the PAC subsequently admitted it. But what we didn't know yet is why. We don't know which parts of the guidance the applicant considers particularly relevant, and we don't know how they intend to use it when the water evidence eventually comes before the inquiry. And I don't think it would be particularly helpful for me to sit here and guess. Perhaps when the water evidence begins, we'll find out. But having now read this document several times, I do know something I didn't know before. I know some of the things I want to listen for. And that brought me back to the question I asked at the end of the last podcast. Who speaks for the water? Because everybody else certainly seems to. The applicant speaks about it, the experts speak about it, the statutory bodies speak about it, the barristers will undoubtedly have quite a lot to say about it. And of course, we campaigners have spent years talking about it also. So perhaps just once, instead of all of us speaking for the water, we should let the water speak for herself. And if the rivers and burns and springs of these hills could speak, perhaps she might say something like this. Apparently you call me water body. I have to confess, I didn't know that was my name. I've had plenty of names over the years. Own Calloo, Own Ray, Burn, Stream, Spring and River. Some of you know me as the place where you fished as a child. Some know me as the river at the bottom of the farm. Some of you cross me every morning and probably don't think about me at all, and that's fine. I don't require your attention. I just keep moving. But lately, I seem to have attracted rather a lot of attention. Scientists are studying me. Lawyers are discussing me. Regulators are measuring me. And mining companies are modelling me, and campaigners are trying to protect me. So perhaps after all these years of everybody talking about me, I might get a word in for myself. The first thing you should probably understand is that I am considerably bigger than the bit of me you can see. You look over a bridge and there I am, a river, but I begin much further away. I fall as rain onto these hills, and I sink into the peat and soil, and I find my way through the cracks and spaces in the rocks and move underground where you cannot see me. Eventually, I emerge again. A spring perhaps, then becoming a tiny burn, and that burn meets another and another until eventually I become large enough for you to give me a name. And from there I keep travelling. And there's something else you should probably know about me. I have never seen the boundary of the proposed mine. I don't know where the red line is. I don't know where one townland ends and another begins. And I don't stop flowing because somebody has reached the edge of a planning map. I follow the land. So if you really want to understand what happens to me, perhaps you should do the same. Follow the water. Because what begins as a spring high in the hills can eventually become part of somebody else's river many miles downstream. Now, while I've been getting on with being a river, you humans have apparently been busy dividing me up. You've created things called water bodies. I understand why. You need boundaries so you can measure me, classify me, and decide what condition I'm in. But I discovered something interesting in that new European guidance. It acknowledges that the size of a water body can affect the assessment. That's curious because I'm still just water, the same water. So when somebody eventually sits in the public inquiry and says, there will be no deterioration of the water body, perhaps don't just nod. Listen for which water body they mean. Where does it begin? Where does it end? Is it at the watershed? And perhaps it's down in Lough Foyle. What exactly is included? Because there is quite a difference between reassured that the water body will be fine and actually understanding what piece of water is being talked about. And when you're listening, do listen carefully whenever somebody talks about my baseline. That's another word I've learned recently. Baseline. Essentially, it means, what am I like now before anything happens? As we discovered in the last podcast, certain metals occur naturally in rocks and soils, and the European Commission guidance recognises that these natural background concentrations can be taken into account when water is assessed, making perfect scientific sense. If something was naturally present in me before mining, you cannot simply assume afterwards that mining put it there. But surely the reverse is also true. If one day somebody is going to say, yes, but some of that was already there naturally, then we need to understand what actually was there naturally. And remember, I'm not necessarily the same after 3 weeks of rain as I am after 3 dry weeks in the summer. I change, the amount of water flowing through me changes, what I carry can change, what is happening beneath the ground may not be exactly the same as what you can see on the surface. So, when you hear people talking about baselines, listen carefully. Because if we don't understand what before looked like, we may one day find ourselves having a very complicated argument about what after means. And by then, I can't take you back and show you. And of course, you already monitor me. Every so often, somebody appears with a little bottle and takes a bit of me away. I go off to a laboratory and eventually return as numbers. Those numbers become tables and spreadsheets, and those tables and spreadsheets become reports. And after a while, somebody in a hearing room somewhere says, the monitoring shows. Listen carefully when you hear those words too, because that little bottle came from somewhere at a particular moment. Was I running high after a day of rain? Was I low after a dry spell? How often did somebody come back? What exactly were they looking for? If people are making decisions about my future, I very much hope that they monitor me. But do understand what the monitoring actually tells you. Because I'm not one bottle of water taken from one place on a Tuesday evening. I am a moving system. Which brings me to something else I also recently discovered about myself. Apparently I can have a mixing zone. Who knew? And we talked about these in the last podcast. It's an area around a discharge point where, subject to conditions, concentration of a pollutant may exceed the relevant environmental quality standards while the water body as a whole remains compliant. Now, I'm a river. Mixing things is something I'm particularly good at, so I understand the principle. But if the word mixing zone ever comes up when the water evidence begins, perhaps don't leave them floating around the hearing room as some abstract technical concept. Understand where the mixing zone actually is and what piece of river are we talking about. How far does it extend? What happens there when I'm running low? What lives there? Because saying the water body as a whole remains compliant sounds wonderfully reassuring, but I imagine it sounds slightly less reassuring if you happen to be a trout living in that particular bit where the environmental quality standard is being exceeded. And then there's another word I've been thinking about, temporary. Some effects upon me may, under particular circumstances and subject to specific legal conditions, be regarded as short-term. I'm not going to repeat you yesterday's European legislation lesson, we've all suffered enough. But if somebody eventually tells you that an effect upon me will be temporary, don't immediately assume they're wrong. Listen instead for something much more important. How did they know? What evidence sits underneath that prediction? What bespoke model was used? What assumptions were made? And what happens if I behave differently from the model? And will somebody actually come back afterwards and establish that I recovered in the way they predicted? And here we arrive once again at those two words from the last podcast, sufficient certainty. They come from the European Commission guidance itself. Before authorisation, the competent authority has to establish with sufficient certainty that a project will not cause deterioration or compromise the achievement of good status or potential unless the appropriate legal exceptions apply. And the guidance says that decisions should be based on soundly documented evidence beforehand. I like those words because often I hear other words, such as mitigation. Whenever something might happen to me, mitigation seems to arrive shortly afterwards. There will be measures, there will be controls, there will be monitoring. There will be systems designed to stop the things everybody is concerned about from happening. And I sincerely hope they all work. Believe me, I have absolutely no desire to prove anybody wrong. But if my future depends upon them, perhaps there is nothing unreasonable in listening carefully to the evidence that says they will work. Not simply on paper, but work here in these hills, in this geology, through wet winters and dry summers, and those days when the rain comes sideways, and I become something rather different from the neat blue line on your map. And that's really what I'm asking you to do when the water evidence eventually comes before the inquiry. Listen to the evidence underneath the conclusions. If somebody tells you I won't deteriorate, understand how they reached the conclusion. If somebody produces a model predicting what I will do in 10 or 20 or 30 years, understand what assumptions went into that model. A model isn't me, it's an attempt to predict how I might behave. And that is why good science matters, not the science that tells one side what it wants to hear. Good, independent science that follows the evidence wherever it leads. Because if you're going to ask everybody else for sufficient certainty, surely you have to be prepared to apply exactly the same standard to yourselves. And there's something else I'd also like you to remember. You've lots of names for me by now. Surface water, groundwater, water body, chemical status, ecological status, mixing zone. Oh, and I understand why. You need ways of describing and measuring me in order to protect me. But don't confuse the language you've invented to describe me with me. Groundwater doesn't reach the edge of a planning application and politely turn around. And a trout doesn't know whether it has just swum into a mixing zone. You created these classifications to help protect water. The danger comes if protecting the classification ever becomes more important than protecting the water itself. Because ultimately I don't know whether a spreadsheet says I am compliant. I only know whether I can still support life. So perhaps I can answer that question from the end of the last podcast. Who speaks for the water? Maybe I've been speaking all along, through the springs that rise where it has always risen, through the fish returning to spawn, through the little burn after 3 days of rain, through the chemistry inside that sample bottle, through the groundwater moving quietly beneath your feet. Perhaps the problem isn't that I don't have a voice. Perhaps you simply need to learn how to listen to it. Listen to the applicant's experts, listen to the statutory bodies, Listen to the objectors and their experts, and listen particularly whenever somebody tells you what will or will not happen to me. Ask something useful like, how do they know? What evidence lies underneath that conclusion? And does that evidence provide the sufficient certainty that the European Commission itself talks about? Because when the experts have finished, when the barristers have packed away their files, when the chairs in the hearing room are empty, I still have to come down from these hills, through the peat and through the rock, through the springs and the burns, into the Own Ray and the Own Calloo, and onwards through every community downstream. So I don't need you to decide my future before you've heard the evidence. I need you to understand the evidence well enough to recognise what my future might depend on. And when all talking finally stops, listen to me. You've been listening to the Save Our Sperms podcast, Voices from the Frontline. Thank you for joining us today. All the links you'll need, from campaign updates to our social media pages and resources mentioned in the conversation, are available in the show notes. Please take a moment to share this podcast with friends, neighbours, or anyone who cares about protecting our land and communities. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your podcast platform. It really helps the algorithm spread these voices further. Together, our voices are stronger. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep standing with the land, the water, the air, and the people who protect them.